Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Filled house here and sure online too. Let's go ahead and open up with a word of prayer. Dear Jesus, thank you for loving us, for watching over us. Today we'll be discussing James 3, not a terribly long chapter, Lord, but a very important one. It's about taming the tongue, how important it is that we speak in kindness and love towards one another, to not lie, to not gossip, to not ruin someone's reputation, Lord, but to only treat one another with the love and respect and honor that you give to us. So help us to do that. Guide us as we read out of James 3 and then move into Martin Luther and his large catechism. Guide us today. We ask in your name. Amen. So we'll be covering James 3. We did James 1 and 2, where James, he's going through a whole host of problems throughout the church, namely talking about this connection between faith and works, where it's important to know that, yes, Christ has saved us. He has forgiven our sins. He promises to raise us from the dead. And because of that, he has given us new life. So get out there and show that Jesus has changed your life. And in that way, we get to go and love one another. I'm bringing this up in the sermon on Sunday. I was finishing up my sermon this morning, and I was just commenting on Ephesians 2, how for it's by grace you've been saved through faith, not of works, so that no one may boast. For you are God's workmanship, created beforehand, before the foundation of the world, for good works. It's a reminder that yes, we're saved by grace alone. We're not saved by works, but in the same avenue, we trust in God to rescue us. We also ought to trust in God that he has given us new life, and that by the power of the Spirit, we can help one another. We can do good. Sometimes as Lutherans, we get so caught up in the fact that the law accuses, we feel bad, we feel guilty. We kind of get discouraged where we actually feel like we can't do good. And that's an important, very important part of the New Testament and the Old Testament, that we can do good. That it doesn't save us, but it saves our neighbor, that it's for the betterment and love of them. And that's what the whole picture of Christianity looks like, that Jesus changes who we are, and we go and we love and serve our neighbor. So that's kind of summing up James 1 and 2, at least in my opinion, in a nutshell. From there, he goes into chapter 3, which is more focused on a very specific issue, which is sins of the tongue, all the different ways that we can lie and cheat one another with our words. So not so much maybe our physical actions, like with our hands and our fists, but really with our words. So I'll cover James 3. It's a shorter chapter. I'm going to do something a little bit different. It'll be like story time for all of you. I'm going to read out of Luther's large catechism. It's good, I think, just to read Luther once in a while. I sometimes feel like we don't get his full tone all the time. He's fun to read. He's a hoot to read through. So you'll see why in a moment. It just, he gives a lot of great explanations about how we love and serve one another, how we are to really use our tongues in order to better one another. But anyway, that we'll do second. So James chapter 3. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For we all stumble in many ways. And if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle his whole body. If we put bits into the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. They are so large and are driven by strong winds. They are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. A lot of fun analogies and wordplay in this a couple of verses here. But the point, he says it clearly in verse 5, where even though the tongue, it's not a large organ by any means, it's smaller than most of the other body parts. And yet at times, in many ways, it seems like it's the most powerful of our body parts, where of all of the things that God has given us, it's our tongue that can oftentimes do the most damage, but also do the most good as well. The same lips that can preach the gospel and preach words of love to someone can also lie and make someone feel awful and tear someone apart and destroy someone's reputation. You can destroy someone's whole life. The 8th commandment, which we'll be reading in a few moments, is do not bear false testimony. So it's coming out of the 10 commandments. If you lie in court and the jury believes that lie, you could very well literally kill someone. Because if you lie about someone murdering someone and that person did not, in fact, do that murder, well, they could be on death row and they could end up being dead. Nowadays, there are sadly cases where DNA evidence comes out and it shows pretty clearly that person that was killed on death row did not do the crime. And so there had to be some level of false testimony, you would assume, along the way for that to happen. But he starts off chapter 3 by saying, teachers will be judged with greater strictness. That's kind of looking towards me as a pastor, where we are held to like this higher standard, where there isn't really any other Jesus passages with him talking about what that actually entails, what that looks like, but it's a reminder to take our jobs seriously. And that applies to everyone. Take your life seriously. Don't lie. Tell the truth. Love one another. Speak words of kindness. And I just love that verse too. We all stumble in many ways. We all sin. We all do things wrong. But if someone is able to not stumble in what they say, he is a perfect man. And that's just a fascinating verse where he's using a bit of hyperbole here. He doesn't mean you're quite literally perfect. But he's basically saying like, hey, if anyone is able to actually completely tame the tongue and never use the tongue for sin, you may as well call that person a perfect man. He's basically saying that the tongue, it's so easy to sin. It's so easy to be tempted. It's so easy to gossip that like if you're able to not do those things, you may as well be called perfect, because he's basically saying a large percentage of sins, dare I say a majority of sins, come from the tongue. Come from us saying things, or maybe a majority are in our heads, not even said to other people. But either way, at least the ones that harm other people, it's almost always the tongue, at least in my experience. But then he gives a few different analogies where he talks about how we put bits and bridles into the mouths of horses so that they obey us. So that it bites down on that bit, and then you can, steer the horse. I don't know much about piloting a horse, but I do know that. And the point is pretty obvious, where if you can tame your tongue, then it can kind of direct the rest of your life. Where if you treat other people with kindness, you build them up, you don't stab them in the back, you don't gossip, well, you'll find yourself with more friends. You'll find yourself loving one another. You'll find yourself in healthier relationships. He builds a strong argument here for the tongue being pretty low to the foundation for really good Christian life. That if we can tame the tongue, you are a good chunk of the way there in being a wonderful example of a Christian. And that's why I thought it'd be really important to read through Luther's explanation of the eighth, because he goes into greater detail than James does even here. Where, like I was saying last week, Luther is not a big fan of James, but I imagine he had James 3 in the back of his mind in a lot of places as he was writing his explanation of the eighth commandment. So like in verse 5, so also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. I kind of skipped over the boat analogy too, where you have this big, large boat, of course, and it gets pushed along by the wind, but yet you move this tiny little rudder in the back of the boat, and that's enough to completely steer and turn the boat whichever way it goes. And so the tongue can quite literally steer the direction of churches, of nations, even of families, of relationships, whatever big and small you can think of. That's what he's saying here. Don't underestimate the power of the tongue. Or like another way of saying this is the pen is mightier than the sword, where words have power. And that, of course, there are times where army can push through and prove that statement wrong, but there are other times where the pen is able to conquer. And it's amazing what our words are capable of, and almost scary too, because like I said, our words can quite literally kill and destroy lives as well. But he gives some great analogies there in that first paragraph. So the second half of verse 5. So I have like a split paragraph between the middle of verse 5. So, how great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth the same opening, both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. I kind of was jumping ahead a bit in my explanation, but here he continues on with his statements about the tongue, where yes, how great a fire, how a whole forest can be burned down from a few small words, or in some cases, the lack of words. If there aren't any warnings about smoking cigarettes or lighting a fire in the middle of dry season, well, you'll quite literally start a fire. But he means this more as a metaphor as well, where a few small words said to the wrong person at the wrong time can completely destroy them or change their life. Like the courtroom analogy, like I already said, how you can sentence someone to death with a lie. Or you can just simply destroy a good friendship when you're talking about them behind their back. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything nice, or don't say anything at all. That's the old adage that's really good to live by. If they're not in the room, my opinion is don't talk about them. Unless you're confident that you are totally coming from a place of concern for their well-being, and you will then take what was said in that conversation to that person and reveal it all to them. If you're not thinking those thoughts, it's gossip. You are talking about that person behind their back. And like, we need to really tame the tongue. It's so easy to talk about people behind their backs, and we really ought not to do that. And that's what he's saying. It destroys relationships. It makes you wonder, is this person really my friend or not? Or are they just going to go and talk about and share my secrets behind my back? And so when we become trustworthy and true, that means we have tamed the tongue. It's a very difficult task to do, especially for many of us. But the rewards are strengthened relationships, loving relationships, actual trust, like real love. Like, how do you know if someone is talking about someone else behind their back? How do you know that they're not going to go and then do that about you? And so that's how you really build trust, is you show good character and not gossiping and not destroying people's reputation. You're not setting all these fires. And verse 7 is just so remarkable. Every kind of beast, basically, we can tame anything on this planet. Like, the world is ours to conquer. The world is ours to tame and control as human beings. And yet it seems like people have a hard time taking control of their own tongue, their own body part. I mean, this is part of us, for crying out loud. And yet so many people have a hard time taming the tongue. It's a restless evil full of deadly poison. I wonder who spoke behind James's back here, because he's really going on about this. But it is really important that we tame the tongue, that we treat one another with kindness and respect. And like I was saying, I mean, I kind of said this already, but with the same tongue, we bless our Lord and curse people who are made in the likeness of God, where we're all made in God's likeness. That goes way back to Genesis 1. We were made in God's image. We are meant to stand above the other animals, to steward and shepherd them, to care for this planet, to care for one another. And God looks over all of it and looks upon us. And yet we can, in one sentence, bless our God and another curse our neighbor. And you can see how there's this terrible dichotomy where if someone is above us in station, it's so easy to brown nose them and try to make them feel good because they can affect our lives. But if someone is beneath us, someone is like a servant, or I mean, I'm speaking from Luther's point of view here, but if someone is like a worker, if you're a manager over them, it's easy to kind of mistreat them. Because you have power over them. And that's another point that kind of goes understated in here, is that power dynamic. You want to brown nose people who are ahead of you in life, and then you kind of can be rude to people who are below you, who have been put under your care. And that's the complete wrong way of thinking about it. Just speak the truth in love. Just care about people. Be kind to them. Be compassionate. If you're a manager, another synonym for that is steward, meaning someone who cares, someone who looks after the well-being of others. Even though you are managing and taking care of these people, and sometimes they do make mistakes, you got to tell them right from wrong. At the same time, you do also need to take care of them and their well-being too. And so it's just, mind the tongue. It can be full of deadly poison. Don't let your tongue be full of poison. And so, yeah, from the same tongue, same mouth come blessing and cursing. This ought not to be so. Then he talks about verse 11. Can the same spring pour forth fresh and salt water? Of course not. That it's going to either be a saltwater spring or a freshwater spring. And he's kind of being pretty severe here. He's saying that you better always be pouring forth fresh water, because if you're someone who's always pouring salt water on everything, always speaking in the negative, always never speaking good about others, well, are you even a Christian? Have you been really redeemed? Are you living out your faith? Salt will kill you. Yes, you cannot live on salt water. Yes. And that's the analogy here, where he's saying you are pouring out death from yourself and you are producing death in others. From your lies, from your hatred, it produces hatred and enmity in that person. It kind of propagates evil. That's the real twisted thing about the tongue, is that when one person does something wrong, it seems to multiply and spread into other people. And it's just a terrible thing to see. And you pray that people really do tame their tongue, mind what they say about other people, especially when they're not in the room, and simply to always put things in the best possible light. And that's even a sin of the mind that Luther gets into, is putting things in the best possible light, because another way we break the 8th commandment of bearing false testimony isn't necessarily anything we say. It's we witness someone do something and we don't have an explanation. And instead of trying to find what the best possible explanation is, putting them in the best light, we just willingly think they're a terrible person or an idiot or something, and we just put them in a terrible light. And so it's very challenging at times to not fall into these sins. And that's why he says, if you can tame the tongue, if you can always be thinking of people in the best possible scenario, you're a perfect person. And so that's his point, is we all do these sins. We all fall short when it comes to the tongue. And so this is a call to really make us better people, to be better people, to love one another, and to speak kind and caring words about one another. And verse 13, who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but it is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So yes, who is wise? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. Where he's saying, if you're wise, you'll understand that we need to love one another, improve Christ's salvation in our lives by serving one another. And don't boast and don't be false in the truth, that if your only motivation is bitter jealousy or selfish ambition, you're not getting the message of Christ. That we're meant to be humble. We're meant to serve our neighbor, to literally give up our lives for the sake of others, to sacrificially love one another, which means actually giving some things up, giving up either personal comfort or some security in order that someone else might actually just have food on the table. And that ambition also seemed to be a big problem in the early church. Paul talked about pastors with selfish ambition, and James is talking about it here too. Look out for people, and not just pastors, but in all lives, that in all walks of life, that are ambitious, that are really only looking out for themselves, that are seeking to really make a name for themselves, and not serve their neighbor. And because, like I said, there will be disorder in every vile practice. That when jealousy and ambition are involved in the heart, and that person's going to bring out all kinds of disorder and all kinds of vileness. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. So those are some real good things that talk about that we're peaceable and gentle with one another, open to reason, being willing to see someone's side of things, willing to hear them and listen, and full of mercy and good fruits, that we show mercy to one another. If someone asks to be forgiven, that we forgive them, that we show them mercy because Christ has first shown us mercy. Impartial and sincere. Partiality is a big part of James. He's already mentioned that in the previous chapters. But his point is, don't show favoritism towards others. Don't be partial towards one person if they're rich over against someone who's poor. Don't show partiality by political views. That's one problem I see in the church in America, is that these church bodies are separating based on politics, and I don't want that to be the case. But then you read about certain things that are going on. You say, well, maybe we should separate just because someone's got to be right and someone's got to be wrong. And so that's a difficult thing to navigate as well. But the point is, if we just treat one another with peace and kindness, there's in 18, a harvest of righteousness sown in peace by those who make peace. So make peace with your words, make peace with your tongues, and you will harvest righteousness. That's the promise, and that's what will be given. I've tried my best to live like this, and I've always had great friends. And I've always kind of judged other people by James 3, and I have noted people who I'm like, I don't know if I should be that person's friend. I should maybe stay away from them. And a lot of times that person ends up in a lot of trouble later on. I want them to have the best possible life. I try to tell them what's right and wrong in a kind way. But if they don't listen, if people don't listen, then they're the ones that end up destroying their own lives. It's terrible to see that, especially when you want them to be your friend. But sometimes that just is the way of things, sadly. You pray that God show them mercy and that they find peace and mercy in their lives and find forgiveness. But we can see that the sins of the tongue destroy many people's lives and reputations. So short chapter, but this chapter says a whole lot. Any comments that you guys have before I jump us into Luther?
Silence is golden.
Silence is golden. Yeah.
That's a part of taming the tongue.
It is, knowing when to speak and when not to speak. Yes, that's really true.
Many now.
Yeah.
You won't get into the politician.
Well, Luther might just a little bit here and there. So at least, well, if we jump back to the seventh commandment, I might read something out of that too. That's a fun little statement. It is.
You better send them this chapter.
This chapter and this bit in Luther as well. So when we're in that's nice. When we're in confirmation, we at least in the Lutheran Church, we teach out of the small catechism. So that's what all of you are most familiar with. Some of you would have probably gone to a church where they probably had you memorize the small catechism cover to cover. I don't know how many of you had to do that. Did anyone else have to do that? You did? Okay. Did you have to memorize the whole thing and stand in front of the church and recite it? Yes, I am getting some nods. Okay, yes. So that's the small catechism. That's like 40 pages of material you go through. The large catechism, it's not meant to be memorized. It's kind of meant as a handbook for pastors that we read out of this. It's a bigger explanation of the commandments of the other parts of the small catechism, because the six chief parts of the small catechism are the same six chief parts in the large catechism. It's just bigger. There's just more to talk about. But there's a lot of really good stuff in here, because all the eighth commandment says is you are not to bear false witness against your neighbor. So don't lie in court. That's like when we say like the actual words of the commandment, that's what it means. But we know that from the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus says, if you hate your brother in your heart, you have committed murder. We know that sins of the heart also count against these commandments, where these commandments are more than just what they say. And so Luther takes that and runs with it, and he writes the large catechism, which is one of the best works of ethics I think humanity has put together. He gives a lot of great advice on just how we are to live, how we are to care for one another. And so when I read James 3, I always think about Luther's explanation of the eighth commandment. And so I'll just read selections out of this and just talk about them. So the commandment, you are not to bear false witness against your neighbor. Besides our own body, our spouse, and our temporal property, we have one more treasure that is indispensable to us, namely our honor and good reputation. For it is important that we not live among people in public disgrace and dishonor. Therefore, God does not want our neighbors deprived of their reputation, honor, and character, any more of their money and possessions. He wants everyone to maintain self-respect before spouse, child, servant, and neighbor. In its first and simplest meaning, as the word stand, you shall not bear false witness, this commandment pertains to public courts of justice, where one may accuse and malign a poor innocent man and crush him by means of false witness, so that consequently he may suffer punishment in body, property, or honor. So he kind of links this commandment back with the other ones, because he talks about our own body, spouse, and temporal property. He's referring to the 5th, 6th, and 7th commandments, respectively. So sins of the body have to do with you shall not murder. Sins of the spouse, he's talking about sexuality with committing adultery in the 6th commandment. And then temporal property would be the 7th commandment, and not stealing. So we've kind of covered those spheres of human life. And then now he's covering lying in court, but also lying in reputation towards one's neighbor. And one thing that I love about Luther is he tells us what not to do, but he also will tell us what to do. These aren't all negative commandments. Some of these are affirmative statements of action that be talking one another up, explain things in the kindest way. And so that's where he's going with this. But he does do what I just said. He defines what the commandment is by its own words. Don't lie in court. So he points it out right away. So then I'll read the next paragraph. This appears to have little to do with us now, but among the Jews, it was an extraordinarily common occurrence. That nation, an excellent orderly government, and even now where there is such a government, this sin still has not diminished. The reason is this: where judges, mayors, princes, or others in authority sit in judgment, it never fails to happen that, true to the usual course of the world, people are loath to offend anyone. Instead, they speak dishonestly and with an eye to gaining favor, money, prospects, or friendship. Consequently, a poor man is inevitably oppressed, loses his case, and suffers punishment. It is a common misfortune in the world that seldom do people of integrity preside in courts of justice. A judge must above all be a person of integrity, and not only that, but also wise and perceptive, in fact, a bold and fearless man. Likewise, a witness must be fearless. More than that, someone who is upright. For those who are to administer justice equitably and to impose penalties will often offend good friends, relatives, neighbors, and the rich and powerful, who could do much to harm or help them. Therefore, they must be absolutely blind, closing their eyes and ears to everything but the evidence presented, and render judgment accordingly. So that right at the end there, we get that statement that justice is blind. I don't know if Luther is the first person to come up with that concept. I bet he isn't. But that is a powerful statement to talk about. Justice is blind. How, like he says, that sometimes if you are put on the witness stand, you might have to offend good friends, relatives, neighbors, even the rich and powerful who may try to harm you. He's saying that you need to be fearless, and the judge needs to be fearless too. He worries about how oftentimes people in authority abuse that authority, how oftentimes justice is not administered. Like we can complain about our legal system in our country. Things aren't perfect. I like to think that most of the time we get things right, but like I said at the beginning, sometimes we get it wrong, and innocent people die for it. So it's a good reminder to always follow the evidence, to not just follow your own feelings, but instead to see what the facts are at hand. And that's just one concern with jury trials, where at the end of the day, either the jury has to judge, or in other systems, it's the judge who, does the judging if someone is right or wrong. And the concern is, well, if they were swayed by a skilled lawyer who was convincing not for the right reasons, they can end up believing lies. They can end up convicting an innocent man, or letting a guilty person go. And so this really matters when it comes to caring for one another and maintaining justice, that we simply look at the evidence at hand and decide where fault is. So going on, the first application of this commandment then is that all people should help their neighbors and maintain their legal rights. One must not allow these rights to be thwarted or distorted, but should promote and resolutely guard them, whether this person is judge or witness, no matter what the consequences may be. Here's a special goal to set for our jurists: to take care that they deal fairly and honestly with cases, that they let right remain right, not perverting or concealing or suppressing anything on account of someone's money, property, honor, or power. This is one aspect of this commandment and its plainest meaning, applying it to all that takes place in court. So he once again speaks positively here. He says people should help their neighbors maintain their legal rights. So whether that's your property, your life, We need to help one another. Don't let these rights be thwarted by evil people. And to speak the truth, no matter what the consequences might be. And so deal honestly, let right remain right. Don't pervert or conceal or suppress anything because someone is bribing you or paying you off or intimidating you. A lot about witness intimidation in the news right now. And so it's clear that we need to just treat one another with kindness and respect and follow the evidence so that justice can be served. Next, it extends much further when it is applied to spiritual jurisdiction or administration. Here, too, all people bear false witness against their neighbors. Wherever there are upright preachers and Christians, they must endure having the world call them heretics, apostates, even seditious and desperate scoundrels. Moreover, the word of God must undergo the most shameful and spiteful persecution and blasphemy. It is contradicted, perverted, misused, and misinterpreted. But let this pass. It is the blind world's nature to condemn and persecute the truth in the children of God, and yet consider this no sin. Yes, sometimes people call one another heretics and apostates when they are speaking the truth, when God himself has spoken in his word and a good pastor goes and speaks it. Sometimes people don't like to hear it. Luther, speaking from his own experience, this is after he's been excommunicated by the Catholic Church. He had all those problems between him and the church in Rome. And even today we run into problems where sadly people disagree. Where I feel I'm trying my best to live according to the Bible, to Luther, and I feel like sadly even some of my pastors around me aren't. Where I think back to COVID, where I read out of Luther's explanation, or whether one may flee from deadly plague. It gave these wonderful examples how we treat one another in a pandemic. And so many pastors wanted to ignore that and just do whatever Trump and the Republican Party were telling them. And I'm like, who are we? Are we the Republican Church or are we the Lutheran Church? And so that made me mad. And this is an example of that. I am concerned about where our church body is going. I think people are being swayed away from the evidence at times. And I wish that they would go back and just be good Lutherans. And I fear that we are losing that day by day. And these are real fears of mine. But in Luther's day, he was concerned about the Catholic Church, how they were calling him a heretic when he simply wanted to preach the good gospel of Christ. That Jesus saves us from our sins. We are not saved by our works, certainly not by indulgences or money, but that we are rescued and loved by God and called and made in his image to do good works for our neighbor. That's what Luther teaches. That's what ought to be taught. I just get concerned when things aren't taught correctly. The third aspect of this commandment, which applies to all of us, forbids all sins of the tongue by which we may injure or offend our neighbor. Bearing false witness is nothing but a work of the tongue. God wants to hold in check whatever is done with the tongue against a neighbor. This applies to false preachers with their blasphemous teaching, to false judges and witnesses with their rulings in court and their lying and malicious talk outside of court. It applies especially to the detestable, shameless vice of backbiting or slander by which the devil rides us. Of this much could be said. It is a common pernicious plague that everyone would rather hear evil than good about their neighbors. Even though we ourselves are evil, we cannot tolerate it when anyone speaks evil of us. Instead, we want to hear the whole world say golden things of us. Yet we cannot bear it when someone says the best things about others. Here's where I think the easy target to talk about this would be the media, where we are guilty of this, where we choose to engage in media that is negative. The reason why negative media is constantly perpetuated, where we're always hearing about lies and the terrible things of our politicians or whatever terrible things are going on, is because those are the news articles that sell. The headlines, the newspapers that sell are the bad headlines. We don't like hearing good about our neighbor. We only want to hear good about ourselves, and we want to talk down our neighbor. We want to be seen as superior to others. It's something to really remind ourselves of, is to keep ourselves in check. But also, it's an important reminder to follow the evidence, like he said, to figure out, to sift and figure out what the real evidence and what the real matters are at hand. And so whether that's in court, outside of court, we're always speaking against one another, like Luther says, and he's just calling us to see ourselves as evil, as people who need mercy, and to use that humility to instead treat others with humility and respect and kindness. That's the transformation that Luther is driving us towards. To avoid this vice, therefore, we should note that none has the right to judge and reprove a neighbor publicly, even after having seen a sin committed, unless authorized to judge and reprove. There's a very great difference between judging sin and having knowledge of sin. You may certainly know about a sin, but you should not judge it. I may certainly see and hear that my neighbor sins, but I have no command to tell others about it. If I were to interfere and pass judgment on him, I'd fall into a sin greater than that of my neighbor. When you become aware of a sin, however, do nothing but turn your ears into a tomb and bury it until you are appointed a judge and are authorized to administer punishment by virtue of your office. So he's saying stay in your lane. So if someone wrongs you, you say, hey, please, let's talk this out. If they don't listen, then you take it to someone else. You take it to a police officer, a lawyer, a court. You go from there. He's following Matthew 18, which is another really important passage for our purposes today. That Matthew 18, Jesus himself teaches that when someone wrongs someone else, you talk it out amongst the individuals. If the person doesn't listen, then you bring it to a few others, then a few more, until you bring it before the whole assembly, where it just keeps on going, where until you hope the person listens, but if they never listen, in the church anyway, that leads to what we call excommunication, where they're removed from the church. It's not because we want to kick them out. It's because they're not listening. They don't want to repent. They don't want to do right. And so for their own soul, they need to understand that they are outside the church. We want them to repent and turn away from their sin, but they're just refusing to. That's where Matthew 18 leads. And he's treating that not just in the church, but also in the court of law, where you don't go and spread someone's evil to everyone else. Instead, you bring it to a judge if they did actually wrong you, and let the justice system carry out as it sees fit once the evidence has been presented. Those who are not content just to know, but rush ahead and judge are called backbiters. Learning a bit of gossip about someone else, they spread it into every corner, relishing and delighting the chance to stir up someone else's dirt like pigs that roll in manure and root around in it with their snouts. This is nothing else than usurping God's judgment and office and pronouncing the severest kind of verdict or sentence. For the harshest verdict a judge can pronounce to declare someone a thief, a murderer, a traitor, etc. Therefore, those who venture to accuse their neighbors of such guilt assume as much authority as the emperor and all rulers. For though you do not wield the sword, you use your venomous tongue to bring disgrace and harm upon your neighbor. Here I see cancel culture. I see the fact that our society is quick to judge. That we are quick to judge one another, and that we simply love to label people one thing or another. And when someone is given these terrible labels of thief, murderer, traitor, any of these things, then we think of them that way. They lose all respect and standing in our eyes. And because of that, it can change our view of them and make us hate them even. And the point is that we treat even our enemies with love and respect. Therefore, God forbids you to speak evil about another, even though to your certain knowledge that person is guilty. Even less you may do so if you're not really sure and have it only from hearsay. But you say, why shouldn't I tell it if it is the truth? Answer, why don't you bring it before the proper judge? Oh, I can't prove it publicly. I might be called a liar and sent away in disgrace. Ah, my dear, now do you smell the roast? If you do not trust yourself to stand before the persons appointed for such tasks and make your changes, then hold your tongue. If you know something, keep it to yourself and do not tell others. For when you repeat a story that you cannot prove, even though it is true, you appear as a liar. Besides, you act like a knave, for no one should be deprived of his honor and good name unless there has first been taken away from that person publicly. Every report, then, that cannot be adequately proved is false witness. Therefore, no one should publicly assert as truth what is not publicly substantiated. In short, what is secret should be left secret, or at any rate be reproved in secret, as we shall hear. Therefore, if you encounter someone with a worthless tongue who gossips and slanders someone else, rebuke such people straight to their faces and make them blush with shame. Then those who otherwise would bring some poor person into disgrace, from which one could scarcely clear oneself, will hold their tongue. For honor and good name are easily taken away, but not easily restored. That's a powerful statement. Honor and good name are easily taken away, but not easily restored. So he's basically saying, even if you catch someone in a sin, it's not for you to go and share that sin with other people. Even if you think they deserve it, it's between them and a judge. He's saying that if you go and spread that terrible secret with other people, it is still false witness because you can't prove the truth. It's your word against theirs. Let them go to court. Let them provide the evidence proving their innocence. Let the other lawyers prove their guilt. Let it stand before the court of law. This is just really good stuff. Just don't be saying nasty things about one another. There are times where, yes, if you're concerned about the safety and well-being of someone in an abuse situation within the home, that's when, yes, you got to take that to a higher authority. But if it's just a personal disagreement between you and someone else, don't be sharing nasty things about them or lies or whatever, or even if it's the truth. Don't destroy their reputation just because you have that power over them. That happens so often where people share secrets, and sometimes it's not the most flattering secret, and they did that in trust, and the person goes and betrays that trust by sharing that secret with everybody else. That destroys their reputation. And this just goes on and on and on and on. And Luther just wants us to all cut it out and just to treat one another with love and respect. Next. So you see that we are absolutely forbidden to speak evil of our neighbor. Exception is made, however, of civil magistrates, preachers, and fathers and mothers in order that we may interpret this commandment in such a way that evil does not go unpunished. We have seen that the fifth commandment forbids us to injure anyone physically, and yet an exception is made of the hangman. By virtue of his office, he does not do his neighbor good, but only harm and evil. Yet he does not sin against God's commandment, because God of his own accord instituted that office as he warns in the first commandment. He has reserved to himself the right of punishment. Likewise, although no one personally has the right to judge and condemn anyone, yet if they are commanded to do so and fail to do it, they sin as much as those who take the law into their own hands apart from any office. In that case, necessity requires one to report evil, to prefer charges, to give evidence, to examine witnesses, and to testify. It is no different than when a physician, in order to cure a patient, is sometimes compelled to examine and touch the patient's private parts. Just so the authorities, fathers and mothers, and even brothers and sisters and other good friends are under a mutual obligation to reprove evil wherever it is necessary and helpful. This is probably one of my favorite paragraphs here because this teaches us something about how Luther sees vocation, where when we're just one person against another, we can't just be going around and sharing secrets. But God does give us offices, that there are magistrates and judges and lawyers, pastors even, like he says, fathers and mothers, where like if a father or mother sees their kid doing something wrong, yeah, it's their job to punish. It's their job to make sure their kid doesn't keep doing that same mistake. Well, the same is true for magistrates. The same is true for preachers. Like if I see a lot of sin going on, like if there's a specific sin that people keep committing, it is up to me to tell you in a sermon or personally that, hey, cut it out. Don't do that. And the example he gives is he goes back to the fifth commandment, you shall not murder. He points out that the hangman's job is literally to kill people. And yet, even though he only does harm and evil towards that person, he is not sinning because God's commandment is that he has the right to punish, and he has authorized hangmen to punish people. It's a fascinating way of seeing the world, where when you're in your office, you get different responsibilities and duties. And so like he points out with the physician that their job, in order to cure a patient, sometimes they have to touch the patient's private parts. Likewise, in the court of law, we need to find all the evidence. In our country, we have what's called discovery, where you give up all of the documents to the other side. And everyone sees the same body of evidence. You're working with the same materials. And then you figure out who's right and who's wrong. There's a lot of court cases that can be decided because sometimes the one side doesn't give up all the evidence. And so then it makes them look bad, and rightfully so. I even know of one court case that happened, the pretty big court cases, the Alex Jones case, against all the lies he said about the Sandy Hook murder, that he was saying that those kids weren't killed in that mass shooting. And he had a court summarily judge against him simply because he would not provide any evidence to the court. Like he wouldn't do anything for accountability, where he didn't give anything. So they said, fine, you're guilty. Now we'll figure out how to sentence you. There are things like that happen where it is the court's job to make sure that justice is being administered. And so we need to find out all of those secrets. It just seems to be how courts should be ran. It seems like common sense to me, but it's very interesting how he points out how we don't share one another's secrets except in the court of law, because we're trying to find and administer justice. A little bit more. But the right way to deal with this matter would be to follow the rule laid down by the gospel, Matthew 18, where Christ says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Here you have a fine, precious precept for governing the tongue that ought to be noted carefully in order to avoid this detestable abuse. Let this be your rule then, that you should not be quick to spread slander and gossip about your neighbors, but admonish them privately so that they may improve. Likewise, do the same when others tell you what this or that person has done. Instruct them, if they saw the wrongdoing, to go and reprove the individual personally or otherwise to hold their tongue. You can also learn this lesson from the day-to-day running of a household. This is what the master of the house does. When he sees a servant not doing what he is supposed to do, he speaks to them personally. If he were so foolish as to let the servant sit at home while he went out into the streets to complain to his neighbors, he would no doubt be told, you fool, it's none of our business. Why don't you go tell him yourself? See, that would be the proper brotherly thing to do. For the evil would be corrected and your neighbor's honor preserved. As Christ also says in the same passage, if he listens to you, you have gained your brother. Then you will have done a great and excellent deed. For do you think that it is an insignificant thing to gain a brother? Let all the monks in holy order step forward with all their works piled together and see if they can boast of having gained one brother. Christ teaches further, but if you are listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Thus the people involved are to be dealt with directly and not gossiped about behind their backs. If this does not help, bring the matter publicly before the community, either before the civil or the ecclesiastical court. Here you're not standing alone, but you have those witnesses with you through whom you can prove the accused's guilt and on whose testimony the judge can base the decision and pass sentence. This is the right and proper way of dealing with and improving a wicked person. But if you gossip about someone in every corner and root around in the filth, no one will be improved. Moreover, when people are subsequently called upon to witness, they deny having said anything. It would serve such big mouths right to have their fun spoiled as a warning to others. If you're acting to improve your neighbor or out of love for the truth, you would not sneak into the secret, shunning the light of day. So he's simply reiterating what's said in Matthew 18. You start with talk with the individual and you work your way up from there if they don't listen. Eventually, you do have to take them into court, and there you pray that you can find a way to improve this wicked person. That's something, too, that we need to talk about. We're like, our system, do we actually improve people in penitentiaries? Are there better ways of doing these things? I certainly think so. But that is another big question, is how do we actually improve wicked people? Because we ultimately should be caring for all people in their well-being and goodness, where yes, part of it is punishment, but part of it is also improvement. Sometimes I think people dwell too much on the punishment side of things, where we just harm these people who have harmed others. And so that makes us no better than them. We ultimately should be trying to improve it and make society better as a whole, I feel. I'll read one last paragraph. Now we have the summary and substance of this commandment. No one shall use the tongue to harm a neighbor, whether friend or foe. No one shall say anything evil of a neighbor, whether true or false, unless it is done with proper authority or for that person's improvement. Rather, we should use our tongue to speak only the best about all people, to cover the sins and infirmities of our neighbors, to justify their actions, and cloak and veil them with our own honor. Our chief reason for doing this is the one that Christ has given in the gospel, and in which he means to encompass all the commandments concerning our neighbor, and everything do to others as you'd have them do to you. And so he just summarizes it in that golden rule there at the end. I love Luther. I love reading through his, especially his large catechism about the 10 Commandments. It's just a great book of ethics to read through. I hope you enjoyed some of it. It's just, I like reading this stuff. It's good just to think about how we care for one another, how we are to love and serve each other, especially with this dangerous instrument of the tongue that we all possess, so we don't harm or destroy someone's reputation or honor. Any questions? No one's tongue is busy today. That's fine. Let's go ahead and close with a word of prayer. Dear Jesus, thank you for watching us, for loving us. Yes, guide us to use our tongues for the betterment of other people. Help us to improve those, especially wicked people. Help us to actually want to help those. It's hard. It's hard to want us to help those who have hurt us. But you showed mercy to all the world. We harmed you by crucifying you and sending you to the cross, and yet you showed us love and grace. So help us to show that love and grace to everyone, without exception on this planet, that we may love and serve everyone, especially with our tongues. We ask this in your name. Amen. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful week.